Good afternoon, it's great to see you all again. Yesterday I argued that we needed a paradigm shift in how we think about biblical law. I said that we need to stop thinking about biblical law in terms of legal positivism, and instead we need to think about biblical law in terms of how the Bible presents it, which is in terms of wisdom. So if you weren't here last night, you are now fully up to speed. In today's talk part 2, I want to explore with you the difference that seeing biblical law as wisdom makes. So last night's talk was clearing away some of the dead wood in our understanding, and today we want to sort of build, if you like, the positive side of the agenda, the difference that's thinking about biblical law as wisdom makes. Now, the first thing I want to say is that seeing biblical law as wisdom reminds us that biblical law is authoritative because it's embedded in reality, and not just because it is a body of rules. If we are interested in applying biblical law to modern society, we need to explain why we are appealing to the Bible as our source of authority. In what sense does it have a real and continuing authority? After all, Americans who are not Christians might say, well, you Christians can decide that it has ethical authority for yourselves, but why should it have anything to do with us? The traditional answer to this question is often expressed in such terms as, God has spoken to us through his word and revealed his will to all people as to how they should live. That's certainly true. The problem is that the answer to the question, why should we, ... when that is expressed in terms of the will of God, we will tend to see that authority, the authority of biblical law, the authority of the biblical social vision, in terms of political authority, not least for the kind of reasons that we were thinking about last night. The will of God in this sense becomes rather like the authority, if you like, of the American government when it passes new legislation and thereby gives us new reasons for acting. And that is a problem because when we think of authority in these positivistic terms, then we will tend to see God as someone who just issues us with rules and commands. And as we saw yesterday, the influence of legal positivism means that we do indeed reduce biblical law to commands, and indeed commands backed by sanctions. God has said, do not commit adultery, so don't. The trouble with this divine command view of ethical authority is that it looks arbitrary. God said, do not commit adultery, but from a purely divine command point of view, God could have said, commit adultery, only he didn't. Now, of course, the reason why God said, do not commit adultery and not commit adultery is because do not commit adultery reflects God's character as a faithful, promise-making and promise-keeping God. Ultimately, the ethical authority of the biblical social vision is grounded in the reality of who God is, and hence, in reality, full stop. This means that the answer to the why question, why should we, ... or why does biblical law or the biblical social vision have any ethical authority must be grounded in some idea of what constitutes reality. And this is appropriate because, as Oliver O'Donovan argues in his book, Resurrection and Moral Order, authority is a dimension of reality. And this is because authority constitutes sufficient and meaningful grounds for action. Authority is not just a matter of commands. It is also legitimating permission. Authority authorizes. It grants freedom to act within boundaries. For example, I have a passport which allows me to join you here in Moscow, but the authority which stands behind my passport, namely the United Kingdom government, doesn't tell me what to do every day when I'm here. Instead, it authorizes me to make these decisions for myself. And so I have the freedom and the authority to spend my time here, happily. With my passport, I am an authorized person. I can exercise my freedom to be here while still being subject to United States law. As Christopher Wright puts it, authority is the predicate, in other words, the basis of reality, the source and boundary of freedom. To give another example, that brick wall over there is an aspect of reality that exerts a kind of authority over us. If I have distorted vision and I walk straight into that brick wall, then I'm going to suffer harm because I have failed to recognize its reality at that point and hence its authority. And in the same way, we live in a world where people have a distorted vision of ethical reality in terms of what is good or what is ethically fulfilling. And this ethical reality also exerts an authority over us. And so when our vision is distorted and we fail to recognize that reality, we will also hurt ourselves at those points. Ethical reality and ethical authority is rooted in what is. And this is how we need to understand biblical law. The authority of biblical law is not simply rooted in the fact it is a command given by a sovereign. It's embedded in every other kind of normative reality that the Bible talks about. As we saw yesterday, Torah is legal precept. Torah is judicial decision. Torah is the fusion of law and narrative. Torah is prophecy. It's not just it is not an arbitrary collection of rules. It is an accumulated, integrated phenomenon. It's an integration of different instructional genres that together express a vision of a society ultimately accountable to God. And because it is integrated, it is a way of accessing a single normative reality. And like my passport example, this normative reality is a legitimating permission. The authority of biblical law authorizes, it grants freedom to act within boundaries. As the psalmist says, I run in the path of your commands, for you have set my heart free. The second difference that seeing biblical law as wisdom makes is that seeing biblical law as wisdom encourages us to look for its normative coherence. I want you to think about the following problem, which I often ask my law students. What is the law supposed to do when it is faced with political controversy. Suppose 50% of people in the United States want to legalize marijuana, while the other 50% think it should be prohibited. The Anglo-American legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin pointed out the quite remarkable fact that the one thing that we don't do collectively is what he calls to opt for the checkerboard solution. In other words, we don't decide, because it's 50%, that marijuana should be allowed in 1 year, say even-numbered years, and banned in odd-numbered years. But the question is, that might seem fair, but why isn't that an option? Why can't we just do one thing 1 year and one thing the next? The answer is because deep down we believe that law ought to involve a coherent vision of justice. We might not know what the right answer is in regard to marijuana, but our commitment to law as representing a coherent system means that what we can't do is just fire off solutions at random. This year it means one thing, next year the opposite. We have to decide, and our decision has to fit with one possible coherent vision of justice or another, and we would find resources in the law to justify either. And that is what we mean by normative coherence. The search for normative coherence is integral to the study of law and legality. It's also, I suggest, central to the study of biblical law, because that too is a legal phenomenon. Now, unfortunately, people are not interested in the normative coherence of biblical law. I suggest to you that people don't want to find coherence in biblical law because they don't like the idea of there being one mountain and one Moses. They don't like the idea of there being only one God and one lawgiver. And also, if you are a modern-style biblical scholar and you are committed to historical critical methods, then what you want to do is to cut up the text into lots of different pieces and then just have a high old time playing off one bit against the other. But once we have reduced the text to fragments, we still have to step back and say, yes, but what does it all mean? And then we have to do something to try to put it all back together again. Even scholars like the Oxford scholar John Barton, who are not especially enthused about the viability of applying biblical law today, still conclude that, quote, the surface details of the ethical system or systems in the Hebrew Bible are generated by deeper and more fundamental structures of ethical thinking. Wow, that's quite an admission. Moral propositions and norms in the Old Testament are not random shots in the dark, he says, but part of a reasonably unified moral program. But that is exactly what you would expect if you see biblical law in terms of wisdom. Biblical law has normative coherence because law and wisdom operate side by side in a carved creation order. That's what we were singing about in Psalm 19. They are complementary modes of access to a single normative reality. Now, in saying that biblical law is characterized by normative coherence, I am not trying to flatten out the texts or to ignore differences. What I'm talking about is precisely the sort of harmony that emerges when you look at different topics in different genres that are written in different ways by different voices, and which, despite all of those differences, nevertheless has a certain continuity and consistency and through line. And it's this that enables us to say, with confidence, what a biblical worldview or a biblical jurisprudence actually looks like. And the more we explore the biblical social vision, the more cohesive we find it to be. With each area, whether it's concern for property, or the political independence of the family, or the need for local justice, all of these things are interlocked and dependent on the rest, which is why when you look at a story like Naboth and you see the miscarriage of justice, how that unpicks so many other areas as well. And if we try to ignore this normative coherence, then we have a problem. I think this problem is quite well exemplified by the British novelist Will Self. It's a problem he creates for himself when he says, quote, "What you need for a revealed religion is any old rubbish. It just has to be in the right place at the right time." And his example is of a taxi driver who writes a book of advice to his son called the Book of Dev. And this, somehow becomes the basis of a new religion hundreds of years in the future, right? So that's what he thinks. It can be any old rubbish, it just has to be in the right place at the right time. Well, no. The reality is that only certain kinds of texts can create the kind of community that will ensure that they survive from one generation to the next. And if the text is about community and preserving community, then the text has to be about more than just the rules that you have to live by, if it's going to be a healthy community. Communities don't just flourish by keeping statutes. So what characteristics does a text need to have to successfully create a group that will regard it as sacred and spread its authority so that it acquires widespread application? There are a number of possibilities here, but all I want to say at this juncture is that one of them is normative coherence. The more normatively coherent a text or a body of law is, then the greater will be its potential persuasive authority. The internal values of the text must fit together with a sufficient degree of internal consistency. And that is the case with biblical law, precisely because it is not a body of arbitrary rules. It is closely related to wisdom, and hence to creation, and hence to God's own character. And people who try to ignore the normative character of biblical law have a problem, because they have to explain how and why it is that biblical law does fit together in a way that is highly consistent and which reliably produces certain kinds of social effects. The third difference that it makes is that seeing biblical law as wisdom means that we have to pay careful attention to its literary presentation. It's often the case that the literary presentation of biblical law determines its meaning. This is because biblical law is, again, closely related to wisdom, and literary presentation is a wisdom value. Think about Proverbs 25:11. Like golden apples in a silver showpieces is a phrase well turned. Now, of course, if you are a legal positivist, then you do not have to think about literary presentation at all, other than to make sure that the law is clear, perhaps. So in English law, burglary is prohibited under Section 9 of the Theft Act, 1968. There is absolutely no reason why it has to be Section 9 of the Theft Act, and its meaning would not be affected one jot if it was placed somewhere else in the statute. Doesn't matter. But biblical law isn't like that, and that is yet another reason why we can't treat biblical law as if it were a modern statute. We have to read it in the form that God gave it to us. So let me give you just one example. Many examples could be given. This is just one. This is from Exodus 23, 1-8. Let me read it to you, and as I read it, see you can spot what the issue is. Okay, so it says, you shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit, siding with the many so as to pervert justice, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hits you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it, you shall rescue it with him. You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. Now, you can see that verses 1-3 and verses 6-8 are both concerned with avoiding miscarriages of justice. But verses 4-5 seem to be about something else entirely. I don't know, what are they about? Maybe it's about animal welfare, or somebody who wrote a whole chapter on this fairly recently, who said, well, it all just boils down to be kind. Well, now, this is the sort of thing that biblical scholars, some of them like to crawl all over and say, well, this is all interpolation, and all of these things got added on, and the scribes were all just so totally witless, they couldn't realize that they put it in the wrong place, and, there's a lot gets written about that. But what we have here is, we got some interesting questions, by the way, about fiction and literature yesterday, so this is for you. Literary buffs. We have a poetic literary device here. It's called a chiasm. Some of you will know it. When you have a chiastic poetic device, what happens is there is repetition at the beginning and the end, and this has the effect of spotlighting the middle section. It pops out, and you go, oh, that's interesting, that stands out. What is its relation to the bits on either side? That's what it's doing. Why is it placed at the center? Very briefly, this is, of course, another reason why there is such richness and texture to biblical law, and it's why it's something that we can and should be meditating upon. If this was a class of mine, I would be getting you to think about what the connections are, but as we don't have time, I'll just give you the answer. The reason why we've got this story about the ox, it's not actually just a story about the ox, is it? It's about your enemy's ox. So why have we got that in the middle, the jam and the sandwich of two bits about miscarriages of justice? Well, the answer is because the passage is concerned with miscarriages of justice, and enmity is the heart of litigation. So what the passage is saying is that if you really want to avoid miscarriages of justice in society, then we must first address the question of how we relate to those who hate us. In other words, you shall rescue it with him. Now, lots more examples of this can be given. And it's not surprising that literary presentation is very important in the Bible. The psalm that we just sung, Psalm 19, reminds us that biblical law is something that we meditate on. We are supposed to be studying and reflecting on it deeply, thinking about the skill with which it has been arranged, apples of gold and settings of silver, and thinking about what connections it is making. So once again, that's why we can't read biblical law in semantic terms, as if it were modern law. This brings me to my fourth point. Seeing biblical law as wisdom reminds us that biblical law is not just revealed, it is also concealed. Ricky Gervais put out a film in 2009 called The Invention of Lying. It's set in an alternative reality where everything everyone says is truthful. Gervais plays a character who discovers the ability to lie. And in one of the film's key moments, he appears live on television to tell the world about life after death. He says that he alone speaks to the man in the sky and gives the people 10 rules which he has scribbled in marker pen and stuck on the outside of pizza boxes. And he delivers this while standing outside the front door of his house, holding a Pizza Hut carton in each hand. It's not exactly subtle, is it? But what he is doing is subverting the traditional image of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments from God on Mount Sinai. And when I saw that, I thought, oh, that's actually very interesting, because it makes us reflect on what is being communicated by how the Torah is given. What is being expressed, not simply substantively in terms of what they contain, what's said, but what is communicated by the mode by which they are given. Obviously, scribbling something down in a marker pen conveys one message. The story of the giving of the law at Mount Sinai conveys another. But what is that message? Now, the question about saying what is being communicated is the traditional preserve of semiotics. In other words, the study of how meaning is constructed and communicated through signs and sign structures. And you'll remember that I said yesterday that we were to think about biblical law in narratival, imagistic, and hence semiotic ways. Semiotics is integral to the study of biblical law because, as I said yesterday, we can't think about how it applies today unless we first think about how it applied then. And that meaning is narrative and imagistic. So if we apply that then to the giving of the law, what images come to mind? Well, the image that comes to mind, isn't it, is of Moses coming down from Mount Sinai carrying the 10 Commandments. Now, that is, of course, the very image of revealed law. And it's quite easy for us to latch onto that to the detriment of everything else, because that does chime with our positivistic outlook. In other words, it's law that has been given to us by a divine being. But of course, when we look at the Bible, we find that there are lots of ways, other ways in which Torah is communicated. Or to put it in semiotic terms, there are different modalities regarding the giving of the law. And that's what I want to talk about briefly now, these different modalities, because some of these modalities, which we tend to screen out, because they don't fit with our positivistic way of looking at things, they are concerned with hiddenness. They are as much concerned with hiddenness as they are with revelation, which is why biblical law is not only an icon of revealed law, it's also an icon of concealed law. So what do I mean by that? Well, think back over the story of the giving of the law. Right at the start, the cloud and the darkness descend on Mount Sinai before Moses even gets to it. Exodus 20, verse 21 tells us that Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So Moses has to enter darkness in order to receive the law. And both then and on every subsequent occasion, he is hidden from sight. Revelation is given in a place of concealment. Later on, we find that Moses repeatedly enters the tent of meeting to receive instruction on behalf of the people. And then afterwards, he comes out and tells the people what the law is. Well, that recalls the original circumstances of Moses receiving the law at Sinai, where he was hidden from the people's sight. Revelation, again, is given in the context of concealment. And then following all of these divine encounters on Mount Sinai and all the mini Sinais of going in and out of the tent of meeting, Moses speaks to the people and gives them the law from what? Behind a veil. This conceals the terrifying appearance of Moses, his face and his skin, which shines with the light of the glory of God. So the veil is another hidden aspect which is present in the very act of giving the law. And because Moses' shining face means that he is not recognizably Moses, it's only his voice that causes Aaron and the leaders to return to him, you could say that his shining face functions as a mask as well as the veil. There's a double masking going on. So why is it that we have just latched on to Moses coming down the mountain with the tablets, but we've ignored all of these other images of giving law? And that is because biblical law is, I suggest to you, not only an icon of revealed law, but also an icon of concealed law. Now, I'm not, of course, saying that there is no revelation. What I'm saying is that there is concealment along with the revelation. And that is not surprising. It is exactly what we would expect if biblical law is related to wisdom. Because the process of gaining wisdom is precisely one of relationship, encounter, and discovery. What Moses isn't saying is, I downloaded them from a cloud. The process is one of relationship, encounter, and discovery. So this really is what we find when we look at Moses' own behavior on Mount Sinai. What was he doing? He wasn't going to a hot spot. And he doesn't actually just go up to the mountain and bring it down, nips up, nips down. There you go. That's the positivist model. That's not what we find in Scripture. What we find is something far more interesting. Moses was up there for 40 days and 40 nights. He was up there long enough for the Israelites to assume that he died, and he was never coming back again. So what was he doing all that time? Well, we're told what he was doing. We're told that Moses waited expectantly for God for 6 days. Interesting. He prepared himself to receive the Torah. We know that he fasted. We know that he worshipped. We know that he even engages in daring exchanges with God in Exodus chapter 32 and 33, which results in God initiating a new covenant, another covenant that repairs the breach between the Israelites and God, and which also leads to fresh law. This is the ritual decalogue in Exodus chapter 34. So you see, the model of giving Torah is not following legal positivism, a one-way projection of power from a sovereign to a subject. No, it is given in the context of intercession, dialogue, discussion, rational argument, and strategic risk-taking. The new law of Exodus 32, 11 to 27 is expressly presented as the outcome of negotiation. All of this means that when Moses comes down from the mountain to present Torah to the people, he presents that to which he is personally committed. He is not a neutral go-between, but Torah's best advocate. He is the person par excellence who understands the law because he knows God face to face. And the same, it seems, is meant to apply to the people in their receiving Torah. Moses giving the Torah to the people of Mount Sinai with a shining face signifies, semiotically, that he now stands in the place of God vis-a-vis the people. He is speaking on God's behalf in giving Torah to Israel. So that means that the people, in turn, are now cast in Moses' role. So they are now supposed to be doing all the things that Moses was doing when he was on the mountain. So they too are meant to be engaging actively in dialogue, reflection, and meditation on Torah. That's what they're supposed to do. And in fact, that's what Moses explicitly commands them to do. He tells them in Deuteronomy 6, verse 7, "You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise." So receiving Torah is a very active and relational thing. It also reminds us that Torah cannot be understood apart from a covenantal and relational framework, again, in which questions of encounter and response are crucial. It is all about relationship, encounter, and discovery. All the things that are true of wisdom in what we call the wisdom literature. Now, Deuteronomy 6 is important because of its emphasis on the role of teaching. And this brings me to my fifth point. Seeing biblical law as wisdom reminds us that its purpose is didactic. I've just suggested that the paradigm of Moses' encounter with God could have applied to parents instructing their children in the home. I've also suggested that parents teaching their children the commandments in their tents might have evoked the dynamic of God teaching Moses on Sinai, or God teaching Moses in the tent of meeting, especially if this was in fact Moses' own personal tent used for revelatory purposes. Now, of course, in ancient Israelite culture, the tent is the place where you hang out and have conversation. And if you think it's a bit far-fetched to suggest a link between God teaching Moses, Moses teaching the people, and the parents teaching their children, then we need to take full account of the fact that both Proverbs and Deuteronomy talk about teaching commandments, or mitzvot, in very similar terms. So here we have Proverbs 3:1 saying, "My son, do not forget my teaching, Torah-ti, but let your heart keep my commandments." Notice the explicit reference to Torah there. Proverbs 6:20-22 says, "My son, keep your father's commandment and forsake not your mother's teaching. Bind them on your heart always, tie them around your neck. When you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. And when you awake, when you rise up, they will talk with you." Does that remind you of anything? Well, what about Proverbs 7? "My son, keep my words and treasure up my commandments with you. Keep my commandments and live. Keep my teaching, the Torah-ti, as the apple of my eye. Bind them on your fingers, write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call insight your intimate friend." Well, this is all very close to the language, isn't it, of Deuteronomy, speaking of the transmission of Torah. As you can see there, "And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk with them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand." So you see here that the father's mitzvot and the mother's Torah, the commands and the instructions, are pushed very close to the commands and the instructions of God. The point here is that Torah is not just handed down from on high, as per legal positivism. It is given in a relational context, as we saw vis-a-vis God and Moses on Mount Sinai, and this is how it is taught in this particular way, as Deuteronomy commands. So here again, yet again, we see the connections between law and wisdom, and you just keep encountering it all the time once you know what it is that you're looking for. And because biblical law is meant to be taught, and taught in this relational context and subject to discussion and rational engagement and all of that sort of thing, it is didactic. And because it is didactic, it doesn't have to be complete. It was never meant to be the Israelite version of Inquire Within About Everything, which was a 19th century handbook about the necessities of domestic living in Victorian Britain. Many problems are simply not covered in biblical law, including some like adoption, for example, which were very common in other ancient Near Eastern legal collections. This is yet another way in which biblical law is not like modern law, which assumes that law is a complete system, even when the law itself is silent on a given issue. Now, in practice, of course, all legal systems have to deal with gaps, because every rule suffers from the problem, as I mentioned yesterday, that it cannot articulate in advance all the circumstances in which it may be called into play. Biblical law addresses this by offering rules which are limited in number, but which are designed to promote wisdom. As we saw yesterday, the teaching of the Lord is perfect, renewing life. The decrees of the Lord are enduring, making the simple wise. The cultural expectation in biblical Israel, which finds its classical expression in the book of Proverbs, is that the study of biblical law in a domestic context, both privately and in groups, results in the formation of a person's character. And that leads to the acquisition of wisdom. We talked about this yesterday, about what Israel lacked in terms of circumcision of the heart. And so when faced with a problem that is not explicitly covered by biblical law, the Israelite is expected to apply the wisdom that comes from the practice and meditation upon Torah, although there are sometimes hard cases when you can refer it up the chain to people who are regarded as having superior wisdom. But the point is that biblical law is incomplete, but its purpose is to teach wisdom, which is complete. So to sum up, seeing biblical law as wisdom has all sorts of implications for how we apply biblical law. It reminds us that biblical law is authoritative because it's concerned with reality, not because it is a body of rules. Spirituality is reality. It reminds us of its normative coherence. It reminds us that we have to pay attention to its literary presentation. It reminds us that it is not simply revealed but also concealed, and so requires encounter and discovery. And lastly, that biblical law is meant to be taught for the purpose of growing in wisdom. What all of this means is that applying biblical law can never be simply reduced to saying, what rules does the Bible have on this or that subject? Or even, what does the Bible expressly say about this or that? Instead, it means drawing on and being aware of a whole host of contextual beliefs, values, narrative, and worldview, all of which we derive from all parts of Scripture and in which we are active participants. It means recognizing, as William P. Brown puts it, the formative as well as normative aspects of Scripture, or the impact that Scripture as Scripture makes upon reading communities, like the one that you have here in New St. Andrew's College. If biblical law has a role to play in shaping basic worldview, values and identity, then clearly this is not something that can just be switched on whenever a moral dilemma presents itself. If the distinctive social vision of biblical law has not already been internalized, it can hardly be drawn on appropriately or effectively in the face of a given social challenge. So what we need here in recovering an understanding of biblical law and wisdom is your aspiration, isn't it, of the long-term nurturing of the community of faith. It underlines a need, again, for biblical law to be widely and properly known and understood, not least in our churches, but also in our culture, so that it forms the worldview out of which we seek to be salt and light in public life. Something I hope that we are in a better position to do as a result of the conversations that we're having during this week. Thank you.